This interview has been recorded on March 28, 2020 in Lebanon amidst the coronavirus outbreak. Originally, we had intended to have the artist talk at the gallery where the artist's work is currently installed. However, due to the circumstances, we have decided to record the interview remotely. The artist is Ralph Hage. The title of the exhibition is An Autobiography as the Universe. It is currently installed at Hermel Gallery in Gemmayze, Beirut. I am the curator, Maie El-Hage, and this is Conversation with the Artist. The artist Ralph Hage and I are having this conversation remotely. Earlier this month, on March 5, 2020, we had the opening of the artist's solo show, An Autobiography as the Universe, at Termel Gallery in Gemmayze, Beirut. We would like to let you all know that the exhibition has been extended until April 23, 2020. In the meantime, the artist and I are going to have this conversation, which we would like to share with all of you. Greetings, Ralph.
Greetings. How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
So when I speak of your art, I usually like to talk about the relationship of parts to whole and how the artwork is really about fragmenting images and rearranging them. However, you are creating patterns that emerge on two scales, a micro scale and a macro scale. And ultimately, the viewer appreciates the painting by transitioning his or her view from a micro kind of observation to a macro observation. What would you add to this?
Well, it's quite complete, but what I would add is that, in effect, this is the continuous process of our relationship to the world, in that we tend to focus on small elements, but whenever we are focusing on small elements in order to be able to give it meaning, we are assuming a totality, or at least a context that surrounds it. So that every fragment in reality is or implies the whole. So whenever we're looking at a fragment, we are assuming the existence of a whole. And this is, in effect, a basis of our understanding of anything. Yes.
But there is kind of an...
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, there's kind of an interdependency of parts on whole and whole to the parts.
Well, that interdependency always exists. The problem is, and the solution, or the problem that is faced by artists whenever they are faced with the challenge of attempting to create something that we vaguely call beauty. We define it as beauty in some vague way. The problem with this is always the conflict between the elements. What we call chaos, what we, in our limited understanding of the world, we call chaos. And in effect, in reality, the notion of chaos is simply an expression of our inability to comprehend the totality of the world, or its higher levels of complexity that escapes our understanding. In reality, there is no such thing as chaos. So whenever the artist is attempting to create harmony through his artwork, in effect, what he is trying to do is limit or reduce the world to human understanding. And in that sense, every expression of beauty, if you want to call it from Leonardo da Vinci up to Vermeer, up to Rembrandt, is only an expression of our limitations as human beings, of our inability to understand the larger complexity and our tendency to describe it as chaos. So in effect, our battle, the battle that every artist engages in, is the attempt to limit what we see to human understanding, to limit what we see to some form of simplicity that we can understand.
Yes, I see. And sometimes we have phenomena where chaos is organized.
Mm-hmm. Chaos is always organized. It's simply our inability to comprehend it that makes us, or that leads us to call something as chaos. So it's always this emergence from chaos to order is in reality the process from misunderstanding to understanding. Every state is perfect. It's simply our misunderstanding of it that views it as somehow, or our limited understanding, of partial understanding, not limited, our partial understanding of it, our inability to connect it to every other thing that is related to it, that leads us, or that makes us think that this is chaos.
Okay. So a question that, okay. Okay, so my next thought, the question I have in mind is actually a prevalent question when interviewing artists in general, but I'm particularly interested in your answer.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you start a painting, and is the process or the end result predetermined or not?
Okay. How do I start a painting? The best way for me, because there are several ways of starting a painting, even for me, this notion that the artist is always unified in his processes is a bit idealistic, I think. Every artist, in effect, has several ways of starting a painting. But what I found was that the best way for me to start a painting is usually to get an image in my mind. This is not something I control. It's usually called inspiration. We poetically call it inspiration. There's probably some, more scientific explanation for this thing. And what it is an image that I know is only the beginning. And from this image, I don't know, and I really don't want to know, where the process will lead me. Because, and this is a completely personal preference, I don't like predetermined processes. Predetermined processes make me feel like I am trapped. That I'm simply executing something. The joy of discovery is absent from it. What I do like is this joy of discovery that comes, well, the engagement, which is not only you're engaging your intellectual mind, but also your intuitive mind, which is the one that is able, in effect, to make these connections, to create these connections between apparently unconnected things. So using this intuitive approach, basically, or beginning and starting with this intuitive approach, I attempt to reach at the end something that is, or that might be described as intelligible. But that intelligibility is never its greatest achievement. It's simply one aspect of what I am creating. The conceptual is, in effect, in my case at least, the result of the intuitive. And I think that all conceptual art or all conceptualisms have at their core, as Wittgenstein would say, the all comprehension has as its core the incomprehensible. My relationship to this incomprehensible is through intuition, through the intuitive process. The disadvantage of it is that you do not control it. But that's also, for some, that can also be described as an advantage.
So picking up on that thought, basically, even in your process, since it's guided by your intuition, sometimes you have to make a choice when to stop the process.
Yeah, true. And that's always very difficult, and it's so difficult that I am very tempted by this process, which is the single artwork for the rest of my life. So what it would be is what I think I'm starting that. I'm not sure that I will be able to continue with it, but what it would be is what in music is called a suite. It's a series of variations, each one taking the one preceding it as its starting point. I think I have started this process, and why? Because I believe that every ending is arbitrary. We choose to end the paintings, but there is always the suspicion, and I think that applies to most artists. There is always the suspicion in our mind that it could have been better, that probably this isn't where I should stop it. And there is, in fact, the opposite suspicion, which I never have, but which some artists, and I respect their view, have, is that they're worried that if they add to the painting, they will lessen it. This is, in effect, expressed by an art Renaissance, great Renaissance theoretical thinking by the name of Leon Battista Alberti, who says something like, the painting or the artwork is ended where you cannot add anything or you cannot subtract anything from it without making it lesser. He believes in that, and in that sense, he is very classical. This is, in effect, the core of classicism, the idea that there is, in effect, a perfect solution. I happen not to believe in that. I happen to believe that every artwork, in effect, is an imperfect solution to a problem tending towards increased perfection. People from the logical disciplines might call me a Bayesian, the one who believes in the Bayesian hypothesis. But intuitively, that has always been what I felt, and it has always been. I had always had slight regrets whenever I stopped painting. I have always felt that it could be better in some way. So it might be that, and it might be, I'm not sure. Again, this is intuitive. It might be that my future direction is towards this single artwork that I will show in its different stages, or the different stages of its manifestations. But with the recognition that this stage is an indication or the beginning of the next one. And this is what somebody like Jean-Sebastian Bach would do in his own music. Take some fragment of something that came before and use it to create the second piece.
You discussed this previously when you talked. We had a previous conversation about the relationship between music and your art, and we discussed the concept of the fugue. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Music and the art. I think that the opposition between disciplines is always artificial. That underlying both music and the arts are the same principles. That musicians are as much geometrical thinkers as painters, and I'm talking about composers, of course, and painters are as much thinkers of temporality, rhythm, as musicians. Because underlying both is something that unifies them. And in that sense, it's absolutely legitimate for, I always consider, well, not always, but for like the last 5-10 years, I've always considered it to be extremely legitimate for artists to be inspired by musical composers. In my case, the one that inspires me most is Jean-Sébastien Bach, because I'm able, well, to intuitively see in his work geometrical structures, geometrical patterns. And these have always profoundly impressed and influenced my, well, not influenced necessarily, but very much impressed my work. Why do I love the fugue? Well, the fugue is basically the artwork having a conversation, or yeah, let's call it the artwork. We don't necessarily call it a musical piece, because it could be a painting too. It's the artwork having a conversation with itself. In essence, it is, let's call it a series of mirrors reflecting each other. And every mirror reflects an aspect of itself, or reflects the mirror that reflects it through some particular point of view, or through some particular angle. And the genius of people like Bach is to take these mutual commentaries. It's the artwork commenting upon itself. It's the artwork thinking about itself. And in that sense, it is, in effect, a fugue is a meta artwork. It's an artwork about the artwork. It's about an artwork about talking about itself. And this is something that that was made possible precisely through the use of, it was not possible before, really, for painters. It became possible through the use of the electronic mediums, electronic media, such as, for instance, what I use most of the time, which is Photoshop. And the reason for that is very simple. For somebody like Jean-Sébastien Bach or any other of the Baroque or classical period musicians, in order to express themselves, technically, I mean, as composers, all they have to do is put dots on a piece of paper. And this is an extraordinarily economical way of being able to express ideas. In opposition for an artist, so what does this mean? Somebody like Jean-Sébastien Bach, he can take a pattern, he can stretch it, he can reverse it, he can take parts of it and make them jump around. He can have them talk to each other on different voices, 5, 6 voices, as in the case of the musical offering, for instance. All of these things were not possible for artists. And the reason is, and I'm talking about painters, I'm not talking about anybody else. The reason for this is very simple, is that when you are painting, your the time it takes for you to express your ideas, it's far longer than the musicians who simply has to put some dots on a paper. Well, of course, taking into consideration that these dots on paper are going to explode into fugues or symphonies with an orchestra. We're not talking about that aspect of the work. But for artists, if you wanted to do a fugue, you had to repeat, supposing that you have to repeat part of a painting. That's a very laborious process. With Photoshop, you're able to do this much more rapidly. So that, in effect, now music and the musical composition and the pictorial composition, the painterly composition, have now joined together. And of course, there was other joining through cinema. We're not talking about that, but compositionally, they are now joined together, so that artists now can, in effect, replicate the ability that up to this point only musicians had. And the complexity, the levels of complexity that could be produced, a geometrical complexity that could be produced by somebody like Jean-Sébastien Bach.
So it's the digital art as a medium that has offered this this opportunity.
Of course, it is the digital art as a medium. Without that, it would be impossible. I mean, it could be created, probably, and I'm not sure if somebody attempted to do it, but it would simply take too much time, so that in opposition to somebody like Bach, who made something, I think, like 1,100 compositions in his life, a bit more, I think. An artist would have to, in order to produce a fugue in terms of visual art, he would have to work for 5 years for a single artwork. I might be exaggerating, but that's more or less in order to express the idea of this disparity between the two. This wasn't necessarily bad, in that it pushed artists towards other avenues. We're not saying that this limitation is bad, and in fact, my intuition is that all limitations are good. That without some form of limitation, an artwork will be superficial. Artworks are, in fact, attempts to triumph over limitations. But limitations can take different forms. This was one of them. This disappeared. Now it's probably our greatest difficulty is, in effect, not liberating ourselves from the limitations. It's in fact finding them. That is going to be our greatest difficulty. How to find the limitations that will define us. It might be that these will be self-imposed limitations. I'm not sure about that. But this notion of limitations is very important.
It will either be on an individual level or it's going to be on a collective level.
It might be on a collective level, yes.
Might be on a collective level.
Yeah.
I was wondering, and I think many of your audience were thinking the same thing. How do you choose the images that you incorporate into your work?
When I started with Photoshop, again, I would have these images, and it would take me an extremely long time. I would look for them on the internet sometimes, but it sometimes would take me an extremely long time in order to find them. At the time, there was no, when I started, digital cameras were very, very rudimentary, still continue. They were extremely rudimentary. We're talking about 1 megapixel. cameras, so they were essentially unusable for Photoshop. Looking for images was looking for them on the internet, and it took hours sometimes to find the perfect image, the one that I needed. When the digital cameras became possible, I simply took the pictures myself. And now I only take the pictures myself. I'm talking about, of course, the natural tendency now is to take my own pictures. How do I choose my pictures, or what pictures do I take? Well, it's a combination between intuition and serendipity, meanings, walking on the street and noticing something that I know has some place in my artwork and taking a picture of it. So it's not a unified process. It's a multifaceted process. In some cases, I still look for something on the internet, but very, very rarely now. I don't very rarely do it. How do I choose them? Again, intuition.
Yeah.
What do they mean? Meaning emerges not when I choose them, but when the artwork becomes, let's call it, in a state that's, I won't call it complete, because that would contradict what I said before, but in a state that's acceptable for me to say, okay, this is a stage of the artwork. So meaning emerges afterwards. I don't start with meaning. I don't start with saying, I want to express X, Y, or Z. I start with the intuition, and the eventual organization of this intuition produces meaning by itself. And in some cases, the meaning is more intelligent than I am. And that's what I always say, that in the case of a good painting, a good painting should be more intelligent than its artist. Just like in science, a good theory should be more intelligent than the one who discovered it. If you take a theory like, I don't know, thermodynamics, I don't think any of the founders of thermodynamics had any clue of the consequences of their own work. And I hope if the work is good, that it would have some similar effect, meaning consequences that are more intelligent than I am, that escapes my predictions. And by the way, reality is always more intelligent than we are.
So based on what you're saying and how your process is intuitive and it's not a predetermined process, I believe that what emerges is an artwork that ultimately becomes transcultural. It's something that people can relate to based on their own observation. It's something that visually speaks to them, but also there's metaphors, there's signals that are universal in ways.
Yeah, and I think that's very important, this notion of universality.
Which brings us to the title of your project.
Oh, yeah. Well, the title of my project, yes, it's the An Autobiography as the Universe.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's influenced by my reading in scientific literature, among other things. It's influenced by my reading in scientific literature and my discovery of the extraordinary beauty of science. Its ability to, give you enormous pleasure when you understand something, and the beauty of the universe. And I grew up during the 70s and 80s in our school system. There was always this opposition between the scientific disciplines and the artistic disciplines. So much so that when you ended your schooling, you were either directed towards philosophy. We had the baccalaureate of philosophy, or the baccalaureate of natural science, or baccalaureate of mathematics. There was a complete separation, this separation between the two. And I think that this separation is profoundly regrettable, in that the scientific revolution itself started artistically. If you take somebody like Filippo Brunelleschi's invention of perspective between 1413 and 1420. Okay. Well, what did perspective do? What did the invention of perspective do? The invention of perspective was the first mathematical expression of the underlying self-similarity of nature. Basically, that nature resembles itself. How did it do that? The way it did that was by saying, okay, this is an object. If you look at it from this side, you're going to see it in one way. If you look at it from this side, you're going to see it from another way. Well, what perspective did was to show that all of these different points of view, in effect, have a foundational description. All of them can be described. This is universality. This is the beginning of science, in a sense, of true science. It has always been understood. The scholastics have understood it. They were completely fascinated by this notion of self-similarity. But the first one to express this geometrically, and meaning mathematically, was Filippo Brunelleschi. This is really the beginning of the scientific revolution. Well, what does this mean? What it means is that the scientific revolution started artistically. And this convergence between sciences and the convergence between the sciences and the artworks and the arts, you still see it today. We don't recognize it, but we feel and we behave in relation to it as if it exists, although we don't name it. I'll give you a simple example. The nebulae that are photographed by the Hubble Space Telescope are some of the most beautiful artistic objects I have ever seen. You might say, okay, this is not art, this is nature. That's actually not true, because the images that we see were color-coded by somebody who gave them the colors that we see today in order, in effect, to produce scientific information. Meaning, for instance, he would give the very hot regions, let's say a blue color, less hot yellow color, and the least hot, or the least heat, red color. And in effect, when he did this, what he produced are objects of extraordinary beauty. So what does this imply? What it implies is that this convergence between the arts and the science exists today. But it has come under, of course, attack by the attack that was philosophical attack against the Enlightenment, and the philosophical attack against the sciences in general. But it is, in effect, of enormous importance to have this conversion again, to rethink this conversion again, for artists to examine the world. And when we say examine the world, not necessarily simply empirically, not necessarily through their eyes, ears, etc., but also through the best hypotheses, the best theories that we have, describing the world, which are, in fact, the scientific theories. Well, what did this do? My work, in effect, is the attempt to relate the individual, the subjective, let's call it, to the intersubjective, to our the social role, and to the objective world where we live. These are the three great ways which our mind organizes our relationship to the world. So in the project that I am doing, it is objective reality talking about itself as if it is, in effect, talking subjectively. This is the attempt to relate these two elements together, or these three elements together. And why do I say three? Because, in effect, every subjectivity is a collective. It's a conversation. A human being is never a unified entity. He always assumes to himself to be, but he is, in fact, several parts that are in conversation with each other, several subjectivities, if you want to call it, in conversation with each other. And by the way, this interior conversation reflects the social conversations that we have. So this is why I attempted this project.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you so much, Ralph.
Thank you.